That morning, cold rain swept across the stone steps of the Riverside Federal Courthouse. In the gray drizzle, a black woman walked calmly, clutching a worn black leather briefcase at the corner. Inside were the files of a critical trial she was set to preside over that morning. Her name was Naomi Carter. No one knew that in just a few minutes, she would shake the entire justice system. Naomi was not wearing a judge's robe today. She had chosen simple, everyday clothing, and she entered through a side door to avoid attention. To the officers guarding the courthouse, she looked like any ordinary woman. As Naomi stepped onto the slippery stone steps, a figure appeared, blocking her path. Officer Richard Blake, a white cop, stern-faced but with eyes full of contempt. He folded his arms, barring the way as if the building did not belong to her. His voice was cold. "People like you do not belong here. Step back before I put you where you belong." Before Naomi could react, she was struck with a harsh slap. The sharp sound echoed across the courthouse steps. The blow did not simply hit her face. It landed on a cruel truth, in front of the doors of justice. Injustice stood exposed. Naomi staggered. Her briefcase snapped open. The crucial files flew in disarray over the steps, pages sodden from the rain. But Blake did not stop. He lunged, pinned her against the cold wall, twisted her arm behind her, and cuffed her tightly. He growled, calling her filthy criminal. Behind him, two other officers laughed. One even took out his phone to record the scene, as though watching a low-rent spectacle. Around them, passers-by froze. Some gasped, scared eyes met, but no one dared step forward. No one dared intervene. They just stood there, witnessing a paradox. Police assaulting a woman right before the doors of a courthouse. That sanctuary of justice. While being restrained, Naomi looked up. Above, the rain-slicked bronze plaque came into view. Courtroom 1, Presiding Judge N. Carter. Only a few steps away, the judge's bench sat empty, waiting, the very seat of authority, which the mocking onlookers believed meaningless in that moment, belonged to the victim before them. In that moment, pain and humiliation flared in Naomi's chest, but deep in her eyes burned an unusual resolve, a light that signaled this brutal confrontation would not end the way Blake thought. Who is this woman? Why does an officer dare do this right at the courthouse entrance? And what will happen when the truth is finally exposed? Naomi Carter was not an ordinary woman. She was a federal judge with over 22 years of experience. Known throughout Riverside for her rigor and her steadfast defense of civil rights. Throughout her career, Naomi had faced hundreds of complex cases. She did more than apply the law. She made it a shield for those pushed to the margins of society. That is why many minority communities trusted her, reverently calling her the gatekeeper of justice. Yet on that morning, the very gatekeeper was shoved outside the gate, all because of a small detail. She was not wearing her judge's robe. Naomi had come early through a side entrance to avoid the press, carrying in her worn leather briefcase confidential documents, files related to a lawsuit against a large corporation deeply connected with the local police department. A case that could shake the whole underground network of power. In contrast to her stood Richard Blake, an archetype of corrupted authority, a white officer with 15 years on the force. Riverside residents knew his name well. Many complaints had been filed about violence and racial discrimination. But Blake always escaped consequence. Why? Because he was the son of a former police commissioner, and because the system tends to protect its own. Blake was used to fabricating stories, turning victims into criminals. He believed that as long as he wore the uniform, his word would be taken without question. To him, that morning, Naomi was just a rude civilian in need of being put in her place. But in this story, there were more than two main characters. Inside the courtroom, there were others, people who would witness the fateful confrontation. Judge Franklin Hale, a senior white judge, was temporarily presiding over that morning's session. He was cautious, but also often inclined to follow procedure and a voice coming from the police side. Prosecutor Emily Rhodes, a familiar name in Riverside, regularly worked with the police on cases. She was no stranger to standing with uniformed witnesses. Then there were two of Blake's fellow officers, Mason and Turner. They were all too used to covering for each other. ready to give false testimony just to protect their own. However, in that tension-filled room there were also some different eyes. Daniel Kim, a young Asian clerk newly on the job, with sharp eyes and a sensitivity to injustice. He did not yet understand the full picture, but his heart told him something was very wrong. And Bailiff Johnson, a longtime courthouse officer who had served under Naomi many times. He knew well the fairness and dignity Judge Carter brought to every trial. If one looked closely, one could see who this woman was. But that morning, all of them saw only a raw scene. A black woman being led into the courtroom in handcuffs. Dressed like a criminal, no one knew that in just a few minutes the power structure in that room would be completely overturned. The clank of iron echoed when Naomi Carter was led into the courtroom. The whole room stirred. The black woman, face still bearing the red bruise, hands cuffed, looked just like a criminal under arrest. At the witness stand, Richard Blake stood upright. His voice rang smoothly, as practiced as the many times he had spun lies before. The defendant attempted to break into the courthouse. She had stolen documents in her possession. When I intervened, she resisted, aggressively, shouting, even threatening the safety of me and my fellow officers. The courtroom murmured. Judge Franklin Hale nodded, eyes flickering with agreement. Prosecutor Emily Rhodes immediately joined in, her tone firm. Clearly we are dealing with a dangerous act. Officer Blake acted correctly in stopping her. Mason and Turner, Blake's partner officers, echoed the story. The testimony was staged like a rehearsed script. The story repeated the familiar cycle that this society was all too tired of. Police speak right pointing arrow, the system believes right pointing arrow, the victim bears the blame. But amid that flood of lies, Naomi stayed silent. She did not shout. She did not try to plead her case. Sitting as the defendant, her wrists still marked red from the cuffs, she simply observed. Every word Blake uttered, she committed to memory. Her eyes, sharp, cold, and resolute, made several people in the room shiver. Even Daniel Kim, the young clerk, felt something unusual. That look was not the look of a criminal, but of someone who had sat on the bench. The air in the courtroom grew more and more suffocating. The defendant was being turned into a monster in the eyes of the public, while the attacker was being painted as a hero. Yet Naomi knew well, the truth could not stay twisted forever. She remained still, listening, preparing. All those lies, she would unravel every single one. And it was precisely that absolute calm that planted a strange feeling in the courtroom. No one suspected that the woman in handcuffs today was not the helpless one, but someone for whom judging truth and falsehood had become second nature. As Prosecutor Rhodes finished her argument, the courtroom seemed to settle into a familiar script. Every eye turned toward the woman sitting silently at the defendant's table. Judge Hale cleared his throat. Defendant Carter, do you wish to speak in your own defense? A faint wave of laughter rippled through the room. Facing the police, the prosecutor, and the judge, what could an unarmed black woman possibly do? Naomi stood up slowly. Her hair was still messy from the rain, the slap mark visible on her face, but her voice rang out clear and firm. Your Honor, first, I would like to dispute the testimony that was just presented. I had every legal right to access this courthouse, under Title 42 of the United States Code on Civil Rights. Obstructing a federal officer in the course of their duties constitutes a serious violation. The room fell silent for a moment. Naomi continued, each word like a blade cutting through the web of lies. I request the preservation of all security footage from the time of my arrest this morning. I also request access to the body camera recordings of all officers present at the scene. The documents I carried were not stolen materials. They are official court documents, signed and authorized by the court. Prosecutor Rhodes hesitated, her face flushed red. The stenographer's fingers froze. She looked up. On the bench behind her, Daniel Kim, the young court clerk, furrowed his brow. He felt it clearly. That voice, that reasoning, could not belong to someone who had broken in. Tension thickened in the courtroom. Blake started to lose his composure and shouted, "Do not fall for this con. She is just impersonating." But Naomi did not let him finish. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a federal judge's identification badge. The ceiling lights gleamed off the golden seal, lighting the room for a single blinding moment. Naomi raised the badge high, her voice unwavering. "I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding about who exactly Officer Blake assaulted this morning." The room fell into stunned silence. For several seconds, only the ticking of the wall clock could be heard. Then, Bailiff Johnson stood up abruptly. His eyes widened, his voice shook as he cried out, "Judge Carter, my God!" A wave of murmurs surged through the room. People could not believe what they were seeing. The woman in handcuffs was the most respected judge in all of Riverside. Johnson rushed out and returned moments later with a black judicial robe and an ebony gavel. He knelt before Naomi, presenting them as a solemn gesture of recognition before hundreds of stunned witnesses. Naomi put on the robe, each motion slow but powerful. She walked to the elevated bench and took her seat, the seat that already bore her name, Presiding Judge N. Carter. Richard Blake turned pale. In his eyes was the horror of a man who realized he had just turned from predator into prey. The courtroom at Riverside held its breath. Naomi Carter, now draped in her black judicial robe, sat regally at the bench. She brought down her gavel. "This court will now proceed." The sound echoed like thunder, striking deep into the hearts of those who had just laughed at her minutes before. Naomi gave her first command, "Play the security footage from this morning." The screen lit up. The video played clearly. Richard Blake blocking Naomi, slapping her across the face, slamming her into the wall, cuffing her, spewing racial slurs. The room erupted into whispers. Many covered their mouths in shock. Naomi followed up, body camera backup. The speakers rumbled to life with Blake's voice, full of spite, "Time to teach another one a lesson." Then came the cold laughter of Mason and Turner, now trying to shrink from view behind the witness stand. Naomi turned her eyes toward them. "Would either of you like to revise your testimony?" No one dared speak. Naomi turned to Blake, her voice sharp as steel. "Officer Blake, you perjured yourself under oath. Are you aware of the penalty for that?" Blake could not respond. Sweat poured down his face. His hands trembled, but Naomi was not done. She pulled out a thick file and set it on the desk. 15 years worth of disciplinary records, acts of violence, civilian complaints, documented racial misconduct, all ignored by this system. With each page she turned, the room grew heavier. Spectators whispered, some even began to cry. Naomi looked straight at Blake. "You are used to hurting people, believing the uniform would protect you. But today, this place, this court, will deliver its judgment." She paused, then repeated Blake's own words from earlier that morning. "Actions have consequences." A deadly silence settled over the courtroom. Then Naomi pronounced the sentence. "Officer Richard Blake, this court finds you guilty of assaulting a federal judge, severe violation of civil rights, perjury in a court of law." The sentence, 25 years in federal prison, without parole. Her gavel struck like a clap of thunder. In that instant, the courtroom exploded. Applause, cheers, people rising to their feet, some crying openly, reporters scribbled frantically, cameras flashing to capture the moment in history. Blake collapsed into his seat, face ghost white, his eyes hollow. The man who once believed he was untouchable was now face to face with justice. Naomi sat still, her gaze held no pride, no glee, only a calm, chilling composure. Because for her, this verdict was not just for one man. It was for a system that had protected cruelty for far too long. That trial ended, but its shockwaves rolled across Riverside and across the United States. Within weeks, hundreds of cases involving Richard Blake were reopened. Innocent people, once convicted by false testimony, were now exonerated. The Riverside Police Department spiraled into crisis. A massive investigation exposed decades of cover-ups and corruption. Dozens of officers were suspended or fired. But the consequences went further. The entire system was forced to change. Security and police body cameras were overhauled with strict rules preventing any deletion or tampering of data. The gray areas that once shielded the powerful began to disappear. As for Naomi Carter, she became more than a hero to the Black community. She became a symbol of justice. News outlets across the country covered the story. Photos of her in her robe, presiding over that historic trial, appeared on front pages nationwide. Law schools invited her to speak, not just to teach the law, but to tell her story. And to honor her, the Riverside Courthouse was renamed Justice Carter Federal Courthouse. On the day the new nameplate was unveiled, thousands gathered, raising signs that read, "Justice belongs to everyone." Naomi's words that day became a national slogan, now printed in textbooks, posted in classrooms. Never underestimate those who seem powerless. Justice may be delayed, but it never disappears. At that moment, the crowd fell silent, and then applause erupted, endless and thunderous. And now, this story comes to you. If you believe justice should belong to everyone, share this story. Show the world that even when injustice seems to prevail, justice always finds a way to speak. Like, share, and subscribe to help spread stories that stand against injustice, racism, and abuse of power, because every small action can help build a more just society.